All right, welcome back to the Crimson Flag podcast, where we bring you a class-conscious analysis of historic and current events which are pertinent to the international working class movement. All right, my name is FBK, and we are joined here by our co-host Danky Kang. What's up today, Danky?
Not too much. How are you all doing today?
Pretty good. I feel that there. This is going to be okay. This is our fifth installment of our comprehensive study of the Moscow trials here. And so today we finally reached the Kirov assassination. And with the Kirov assassination, this is where a lot of studies into the Moscow trials begin. I think, as you'll notice, it references a lot of what we talked about in the previous episodes, and especially those earlier debates in the 1920s. So hopefully that all ties in. But yeah, before we talk about the Kirov assassination here, I did want to say, well, apparently, there are communist takes on the Kirov assassination on YouTube. I know Finnish Bolshevik has a good video talking about that in the Moscow trials. Unfortunately, there isn't just one video that's dedicated to just talking about the Kirov assassination from a communist perspective. A lot of them are just kind of taking the bourgeois historian kind of take. And unfortunately, a lot of those videos that you'll see today reference old material that isn't even used in Soviet scholarship today. Hopefully we kind of bring that out. I might even show a couple of videos during this of these arguments that current YouTube historians, at least, are putting out there, and how these narratives have long been kind of thrown out the window. But yeah, so before we begin here, I wanted to get your take here real quick, Danky King. Give us the bourgeois interpretation of the assassination of Sergei Kirov to the layperson, like, that has heard of this. What is probably their understanding of it?
Right. So the usual narrative about the Kirov assassination is that Kirov was this young upstart in the party who was more popular than Stalin, and everybody liked Kirov, and Stalin, in his jealousy and his paranoia, had Kirov killed because he couldn't handle that Kirov was more popular. And so they usually point towards Kirov's assassination as being the start of Stalin's evil reign of terror. But yeah, that's the basic bourgeois narrative on the Kirov assassination. And most people simply stop there and don't investigate it any further.
Yes, that is true. I've definitely heard the jealousy argument. There's also the argument that Kirov made Stalin mad during the Ryutin affair, which we talked about in the previous episode, because supposedly in this meeting that we don't even have a transcript of, these historians say that Kirov disagreed with Stalin about executing this Ryutin character who was promoting counter-revolutionary material within the party. We don't really have confirmation of that. So a lot of these accounts that say that Stalin wanted Kirov killed, we don't really have factual evidence of that, even though you'll hear that mentioned quite often in these other videos. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that in the beginning. So we just kind of had everybody up to speed with what is the general consensus on the Kirov assassination to the average person, from what they're just consuming on the internet, at least. But yeah, with that, we'll begin here. So our comprehensive study on the Moscow trials now reaches that point where many studies choose to begin, with the assassination of the then first secretary of the All-Union Communist Party of Leningrad, Sergei Mironovich Kirov. With the investigation into Kirov's assassination, several important discoveries were made that would lead directly into the Moscow trials. This would happen when the investigation into the assassination led the NKVD to first discover the involvement of Zinovievites. The investigation into the ties between these oppositionists would later uncover the involvement of an underground network of Trotskyists and rightists. Klobak, which is the Russian word for tangle, was the name that NKVD would give to this organization due to the hodgepodge of ideologies that coalesced against the Soviet leadership. Later in the Moscow trials, it would be referred to as the Trotskyist Zinovievite bloc. So what we're going to do is devote this episode to the assassination of Sergei Kirov. This will establish a foundation for when we later examine the Kirov assassination, when this is referenced throughout the Moscow trials. But before we do so, let's discuss the larger significance of the Kirov assassination. We touched on the point that Kirov's murder leads into the Moscow trials. Further, in Khrushchev's infamous secret speech, wherein he claims that Stalin had innocent people framed for the Moscow trials and that no conspiracy had in fact threatened the Soviet leadership at the time, he heavily implies that Stalin could have had Kirov murdered. Khrushchev's men, with the hope that the assassination could be pinned on Stalin, went as far to reinvestigate the murder of Kirov and create a report. Despite this effort, no evidence was found in support of this hypothesis, leaving Khrushchev's team of researchers to argue that Kirov was murdered by a lone assassin. However, another reform-minded Soviet politician found it useful to use claims of atrocities against Stalin for the purpose of fending off those in the party who sought to temper his reforms. This would, of course, be Mikhail Gorbachev, who also had his men reinvestigate the Kirov murder for a third time in the 1980s, hoping that the third time would prove a charm and that Stalin's guilt would be exposed before the world. This once again proved a failure, leading Gorbachev's men to also fall back on the lone gunman theory that Kirov was killed by a disgruntled ex-party member with no ties to a counter-revolutionary bloc. Although Khrushchev's and Gorbachev's men couldn't find the evidence to support their preferred narrative, this didn't stop the anti-Soviet Cold War era literary crew from popularizing the idea that Stalin may have been guilty of the murder of his comrade. This anti-Soviet Cold War era literary crew has indeed caused a great amount of confusion for the everyday person researching the Kirov assassination. Although no one will take you credible in the modern world of Soviet studies if you claim that Stalin had Kirov assassinated, this remains a popular view amongst people outside of those circles. Indeed, two of the most accessible books on the Kirov assassination available to English readers is Robert Conquest's 1988 Stalin and the Murder of Sergei Kirov and Amy Knight's Who Killed Kirov? The Kremlin's Greatest Mystery, which both claim that Stalin had Kirov murdered. This is despite the current scholarly world of Soviet studies, who overwhelmingly reject this view and rely instead on the lone gunman theory. So before we go to the next part here, I didn't know if you wanted to comment there, if you had any type of reaction there, comrade.
Yeah, I just feel like this seems to happen throughout Soviet studies, especially when it approaches Stalin, is that a lot of people will cite these older works, and these older works largely rely on anecdotal evidence or just manufactured evidence entirely to suit their extremely biased narrative. And so current scholars who have no political skin in the game, they have no real bias towards or against the Soviet Union, are deciding objectively through investigation that Stalin didn't have Kirov killed by all available evidence. And nevertheless, though, the prevailing interpretation and the prevailing idea is, of course, that Stalin did have Kirov killed. And I feel like the fact that modern scholars disagree with this commonly assumed narrative just shows how the narrative around Stalin as a whole is being controlled by the mass media, and it's being controlled and filtered through our educational system to not really teach the truth, but to teach this extreme biased view of Stalin as this bloodthirsty dictator.
Yeah, and that's actually going to kind of transition well into our next part here. As far as these scholars right now, though, yes, one thing that you'll notice, though, is that even though there are slight, subtle changes to the story, the overarching narrative hasn't changed, that Stalin had innocent people murdered for the Moscow trials. You know, that part of it has never budged, but there's little cracks in it that have been picked away at times. And a lot of times these scholars, for example, a famous one is Matthew Leno, who gave a report on Kirov's murder in 2011. In his research, he even apologizes pretty much in the beginning and is like, look, Stalin didn't have Kirov murdered, but I think Stalin is a horrible person, blah, 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 blah. So he's pretty much like saying like, sorry, but this is just what I discovered. And you can see through his research, he probably is genuinely anti-communist, and he still thinks the Moscow trials were fabricated. But sometimes the lies are just so bold that even these people are like, we got to give way a little bit here. But I think that's interesting. But yeah, that will transition well into the next part. We're going to talk right now about the anti-Stalin paradigm, and this will be before we talk about the actual events of Kirov's assassination. So, to better understand this conscious disinformation campaign, we can examine what notable author on Soviet history, Dr. Grover Furr, has termed the anti-Stalin paradigm. This paradigm can be viewed as a framework, one which tacitly silences any historian on the 1930s USSR period who dares come to any conclusion that may question the official narrative of that time period. Any aspiring Soviet historian who tries will find it extremely difficult to have any research into this period published in the relevant scholarly journals. Critics may quickly assume that this is because of biased and inaccurate research coming from those who come to the conclusion that a counter-revolutionary bloc did in fact threaten the Soviet leadership with assassinations. However, it becomes clear to the honest researcher that it requires bias and inaccuracy to conclude that the bloc was not a threat. Hopefully our study into these matters will make this clear. From Dr. Grover Furr's book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, he said, quote, "The whole mainstream or anti-Stalin paradigm of the high politics of the USSR during the 1930s depends on the assumption that Nikolaev, who was Kirov's assassin, was not part of a conspiracy, but a lone gunman," unquote. In other words, if we are to view the official scholarly narrative of the Moscow trials as a set of Jenga blocks, proving that Nikolaev was indeed involved in a terrorist bloc with the other defendants of the Moscow trials would effectively cause the structure to crumble. Researcher into the assassination of Kirov, Matthew E. Leno, who is no fan of Stalin as he ultimately concludes that Kirov was a lone gunman, understands this point as well, as he said, and if you want to read this quote here, comrade.
Yeah, so Leno says, if the official charges in the first two trials that former Zinoviev supporters had conspired to murder Kirov were entirely bogus, then the indictments in all of the succeeding show trials collapsed. But if there was some truth in the charge that Zinovievites conspired to kill Kirov, then that preserved the possibility of arguing that the latter charges were also valid, at least in part.
Yeah, thank you. So just real quick to talk about that, what we see, even though we haven't gotten into the Moscow trials themselves, a lot of this is based around the assassination of Kirov. So there's a lot of weight just on this one event. So, you know, as this historian here, Matthew Leno, points out, if you can prove that Nikolaev, the assassin, did have these ties to other groups, and, you know, it was a larger movement that was trying to do these assassinations, then that would prove that, you know, the Moscow trials were in some fashion justified. I don't know if you wanted to make a quick comment or anything on that before we move on here, though, comrade.
Yeah, I don't know what basis they cite this lone gunman theory on, because, I mean, as we've covered in past episodes, there have been repeated attempts to undermine the authority of the Communist Party from within. And so it would follow that a continuation of that would be some sort of oppositionist bloc that was a union between this Zinovievite faction and these Trotskyite factions. And it makes perfect sense that someone would try to kill Kirov, who was part of this opposition bloc. But the fact that this assassin, Nikolaev, was some sort of a lone gunman who just had a personal vendetta against Kirov, to me, it just doesn't really hold up. I mean, what evidence, if any, do they provide that implies that Nikolaev was a lone gunman?
Yeah, if anything, it more requires them to leave out important pieces of evidence, especially Nikolaev's journals, as we'll soon see, because he documents the kind of people he was talking to. But yeah, so we'll go on to the actual events themselves. So people who are maybe critical of this and are suspicious of these claims that we're making We can argue them a little more deeply here. So uncovering the plot. So the assassin, Leonid Vasilovich Nikolaev, worked in the Rabkrim, or the People's Commissariat of Workers and Peasants Inspections, until he was demoted to a lesser position. He joined the party in 1920 at the age of 16. In March of 1934, he had been expelled from the party for a breach of discipline. 2 months later, however, he was reinstated. So that's just a little on the assassin there. So the details of Sergei Kirov's assassination are largely agreed upon. On the 1st of December 1934, Kirov entered the Leningrad Soviet, a building popularly known as Smolny. After reaching the second floor, he was approached from behind by a gunman, Leonid Nikolaev, who proceeded to fatally wound him with a shot to the back of the head. After doing so, Nikolaev was said to have attempted to commit suicide, but instead passed out next to the wounded Kirov. From here, however, we reach the point of contention where our analysis differs from the bourgeois historians. When Nikolaev was first brought in for questioning by the Leningrad NKVD, he claimed that the murder was solely his own work, a lone gunman, if you will. He initially claimed that his treatment from fellow party members led him to seek revenge. Remember that Nikolaev had been dismissed from the party in 1934 and reinstated at a somewhat lower position. In those first interrogation transcripts, we see Nikolaev repeatedly claim that party members had treated him in a way in which no human should be treated. However, this lone wolf assassin story began to fall apart. By December 4th, 3 days after the assassination, the NKVD began to question Nikolaev on ties to Trotskyists and other former oppositionists. So here's a quote from one of, this is December 4th, and this is Nikolaev being questioned by the NKVD. Would you want to read this exchange right here, Danke?
Yeah, so Agranov says, what influence did your connections to former oppositionists and Trotskyites have on your opinions to kill Comrade Kirov? Nikolaev responds by saying, my ties with the Trotskyists, Shatsky, Vanya Koltyonov, Nikolai Bardin, and others influenced my decision to kill Comrade Kirov. However, I knew these people not as a member of any group, but as individuals.
Okay, cool. And so what led the NKVD to begin questioning Nikolaev on ties to Trotskyists? Well, by this point, the NKVD had already thoroughly read his personal journals. These journals contained intimate information regarding Nikolaev's ties to people who were regarded as former oppositionists. These oppositionists go back to the time of the debates of the 1920s, which is discussed in depth in parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series. From here, other individuals who were later found to be involved with Kirov's assassination began to face interrogation. The names start from some of those mentioned in Nikolaev's journals. Once these people are questioned, the web of others involved begins to unveil. Here's the highlights of how this goes down, and I'll post my sources to back it up in the description. On December 5th, Nikolaev claimed that had his assassination attempt failed, he would have recruited Bardin, Shatsky, and Kotolinov in the affair. On the 6th, he abandoned the lone gunman claim and admitted that a conspiracy indeed did exist with Shatsky and Kotolinov involved. He also implicated 2 others on this day. On the 7th of December, the NKVD had Shatsky in for questioning. After first denying to have known Nikolaev, Shatsky would later admit that he indeed did know Nikolaev. The following quote from Nikolaev's interrogation of December 8th shows us a good general summary of the somewhat wider plot into the assassination of Sergei Kirov. As he said, and would you mind reading this? This is a little bit of a lengthy one here, but he sums it up here.
Right. So he says the Kotolinov group was preparing a terrorist act against Kirov, and its direct implementation was entrusted to me personally. I knew from Shatsky that the same task had been given to his group as well, and that this work was being carried out by it independently of our preparation for the terrorist act. I first met Shatsky in 1933. Our meeting was in the summer of 1934, at 28 Krasny Zarya Street, where Shatsky was conducting surveillance of the apartment and establishing all Kirov's movements. He was doing this with the aim of preparing a terrorist act. Kotolinov said that getting rid of Kirov would weaken the party's leadership. Kotelyanov worked out the technical aspects of carrying out the act directly with me, approved the technique, specifically verified how accurately I could shoot. He was my direct leader in carrying out the act. Sokolov explained how suitable this or that point is, Kirov's usual route was, and in doing so made my work easier.
Yeah, so on the 9th of December, the focus on the investigation turned towards Zinoviev, Kamenev, and their contacts, such as Rumianstev, who had admitted to having a meeting with Zinoviev and Kamenev. As Zinoviev and Kamenev were in Moscow, with an apparent group of supporters located there and in Leningrad, the two organizations were dubbed the Moscow and Leningrad Centers. In part 3 of this series, we covered the expulsion of the Trotskyists and Zinovievites after the first bloc revealed itself to practice methods of struggle that went against the norms of a Leninist party. You may remember that although Trotsky refused, others capitulated and self-criticized with the promise of rejoining the party. So Zinoviev, up until the time of his expulsion and reinstatement into the party, was the first secretary of the Leningrad Party organization. He effectively lost his job to Sergei Kirov once he was forced to leave the position. This motive was confirmed by the defendants in the Moscow trials, who later claimed that this was true. It should also be kept in mind that despite Zinoviev's relinquishment of the first secretary position, he still held influence in Leningrad. His influence in the city was displayed when in 1925, he organized for the Leningrad delegation to boycott the 14th Party Conference. It's interesting to note that the NKVD realized Trotskyists and Zinovievites were working together into the assassination of Sergei Kirov. However, the discovery of the Trotsky-Zinoviev bloc wasn't confirmed until the extent of its organization was realized with evidence. They seem to have first focused their attention on the Zinovievites in regards to Kirov's murder, as they understandably would have a larger presence in Leningrad. Unfortunately, we don't have, and apparently never will have, important information that was gathered by the NKVD on Zinovievites in Leningrad during the time in question. On April 13th of 1956, a commission dubbed the Molotov Commission was assigned to investigate the Kirov assassination and the question of whether Nikolaev truly had accomplices or if they were framed by Stalin. Historian Matthew E. Leno sums up the questions that the commission were asking when he said, and if you want to read this quote here, comrade.
So he says, was Nikolaev a Zinovievite? What were his ties to the Zinovievite groups? What activities in Leningrad were the Zinovievites up to? These questions are attributed to the desire of Molotov and his allies to defend at least the 1934-1935 version of the crime as presented at the trials of the Moscow and Leningrad Center.
Right. So Khrushchev had noticed this as well, and he responded by having the Soviet file, a file which contained the NKVD's surveillance records on Zinovievites in 1930s Leningrad, destroyed by the KGB. This would have occurred in January 27th of 1956. However, due to Soviet historian Alla Kurlina's research on the case, she gives us an interesting account of one of Nikolaev's interrogation transcripts. Currently, some of these transcripts are accessible to researchers. Kurlina, whose allegiance was to the Gorbachev quest to continue the historical vilification of Stalin, quotes from a transcript that doesn't appear to be accessible to everyone. However, she doesn't give an exact date, only that it occurred after December 4th. Her account of the transcript states that Nikolaev confessed, and here's another quote.
So it says, he was a member of an underground counter-revolutionary organization. Its members stood on the platform of the Trotskyite Zinovievite bloc. The former opposition had their own accounts to settle with Kirov in connection with the struggle he organized against the Leningrad oppositionists.
Right. So from this, we learn two important aspects of the Kirov assassination. One, that the group organized stood on the platform of the old Trotskyist Zinovievite bloc, as mentioned in part 3 of the series. This could have been the moment where the NKVD first learned of the bloc of Trotskyists and Zinovievites could possibly have remained organized to some extent. Secondly, we learned that this bloc of oppositionists had their own accounts to settle with Kirov. So I know we talked about that a little bit in the beginning there, Danke, where we were talking about this narrative of, well, Stalin was jealous or didn't like Kirov, and he might have had him killed. Where we're really seeing, first of all, this doesn't prove it's true, but Zinoviev would have had more motive, and he has influence, and it's proven that he's contacting these people in Leningrad, although he's in Moscow at the time. So, I mean, it shows that there were other forces in there who probably had more of a motive than Stalin. But what would you say about that?
So it's sort of discrediting even further this bourgeois narrative that Nikolaev was this lone gunman who had no ties to this opposition group. And I find it funny how even like bourgeois historians and people who are sympathetic towards like Gorbachev and stuff are citing these lines of evidence which shows that like Nikolaev was not this lone gunman. So it's funny when even like the bourgeois historians and the people who are trying to slander Stalin wind up like dispelling some of these rumors about him.
Yeah, and it's like little tidbits of information because, yeah, Kralina, she was actually over Kirov's museum, which lasted up until the end of the USSR, I think. And so she's all for the lone gunman theory, but you can tell she's reading documents that haven't been released to us yet. And it gets a little iffy because, you don't know what exactly is said and if you can back this up. But some of the stuff she's citing actually kind of goes against her narrative. So it's like, it's very interesting to see that happen for sure. But yeah, so more on the events surrounding Kirov's murder. A man by the name of Borisov was the person whose responsibility was to bodyguard Kirov. On December 2nd, the day after the murder, Borisov was summoned by the Leningrad NKVD to the Leningrad Soviet building. On the way, a seemingly random automobile accident would end his life. Pavel Bulanov, in the third trial of 1938, would claim that, and if you want to read his quote here, comrade.
Sure. He says, Zaporozhets, the deputy head of the Leningrad NKVD, being alarmed by this and fearing that Borisov would betray those who stood behind Nikolaev, decided to kill Borisov. Zaporozhets so arranged it that an accident occurred to the automobile which took Borisov to the Smolny. Borisov was killed in the accident, and this is the way they got rid of a dangerous witness.
Yeah, so in response to the strange events, practically the entire Leningrad NKVD leadership was sacked and promptly taken to trial for, quote, negligence in connection with their duties, unquote. Was the Leningrad NKVD leadership really guilty of negligence of their duties, or was this a Stalinist invention? Well, at best, the Leningrad NKVD's handling of the situation was incredibly stupid. At worst, one could call it counter-revolutionary. For example, Nikolaev's sentiments and threats had been disclosed to deputy head of the Leningrad NKVD, Ivan Zaporofets, who apparently took no measures in light of this knowledge. Okay, also a few days before the murder, Nikolaev was searched by the NKVD after lurking around the Smolny building. As a loaded pistol and a diary were found in his briefcase, he was taken to the commandant's office. Stunningly, he was apparently released and faced no repercussions. We'll return to the statements of the third trial defendant Paul Bulanov, who shed lights on this strange situation, as he said, and if you don't mind reading that there.
Right, so Bulanov said, I recall that several days before the assassination of Kirov, the guard detained Nikolaev, and a notebook and revolver were found in his portfolio, but that Zaporofets released him in time.
Yeah, so in response to the strange activity of the Leningrad NKVD leadership, Yakov Agranov was then given temporary leadership over the organization and would head the investigation as well. The new temporary head of the Leningrad NKVD, Agranov, soon established that there were links between Nikolaev, the Leningrad Komsomol, or the Young Communist League. Nikolaev's branch of the Komsomol was headed by I.I. Kotolianov, who was established as a chief accomplice of the assassination. From here, the investigation proceeds, as was mentioned before. On December 28th and 29th, the trial of the Leningrad Terrorist Center would result in Nikolaev and 13 other accused persons would receive a formal indictment for the assassination. The trial was soon held, and the persons convicted were immediately shot. So that's just a little more about the strangeness around the events and such. I think we got one more section after this to go, but that is another part of it that you won't hear mentioned much. But if you do hear this stuff mentioned in these old bourgeois narratives and stuff, they'll say that this is evidence of Stalin acting sneakily and telling the Leningrad NKVD to kill the bodyguard of Kirov and stuff like that. But what do you take of all that activity, though, comrade?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I think it continues to disprove and discredit the lone gunman theory, because it shows that Nikolaev at least had people in positions of influence, like this Zaporozhets guy, who would help him out. And so I feel like even more, it just exposes that the bourgeois narrative around Kirov's assassination is false.
Yeah, because, I mean, could you imagine? I mean, at the end of the day, we're dispelling these bourgeois narratives, but the Soviet Union was not a place where I feel like they would play around bringing guns into government buildings, as
Right.
guns were illegal in the first place. So everything about this is like extremely strange. So yeah, it is just odd all around to see that happening. It shows that something is definitely going on, to say the very least. But yeah, so our last little section here to finish this off, we're going to talk about the Moscow Terrorist Center. So, unlike many of the previous trials of oppositionists and wreckers, the party would follow the trail of connections to the Kirov assassination as far as they could go. It didn't take very long, for as soon as December 14th, arrests also began in Moscow of those suspected of having connections to the assassination. Prominent Bolsheviks, Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, would be among those arrested in this particular case. However, sufficient evidence for their involvement in the conspiracy was lacking, as the evidence could only prove that the group had knowledge of and contact with the Leningrad Center. Zinoviev and Kamenev's case was then sent to the special board of the NKVD, who recommended internal exile for a third time in their careers. Their group would be labeled the Moscow Center. When more evidence of their connections was gathered, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and 14 others would end up facing a trial in January of 1935. Zinoviev and 3 other figures ended up receiving 10 years imprisonment as the most active members of the center. Kamenev and 2 others received 5 years imprisonment as less active members, while others received up to 6 to 8 years for their participation. In a way, this could be viewed as a warm-up to the Moscow trials, which would begin a year later with the case of the Trotskyist-Zinovievite Terrorist Center. So what was the evidence against Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the others involved in the Moscow Center? The NKVD admitted that it could not establish directions coming from or involvement from the members of the center in the assassination of Kirov. However, they were able to establish that its members were well aware of the plot and did not report it to the Soviet authorities. Concealing this kind of information was considered a crime under Soviet law, just like when Zinoviev and Kamenev were exiled in 1933 for suppressing their knowledge that Ryutin had been secretly distributing a document which called for the assassination of Soviet leadership. Yevdokimov, who was also a defendant in this January 1935 trial, had this to say of the charges against himself and the others. And I think you got another quote here, comrade.
Yeah, he says, "When we were blamed for a terrorist attitude, I firmly declare, yes, for that we must take responsibility, for the venom by which we poisoned those who surrounded us over the last decade and which made possible a supreme crime, the murder of Kirov."
Right. So after this, there was a trial of the Leningrad security officials who were arrested on the 4th of December once it was clear that their behavior was strange, to say the least. The charge against them was criminal negligence, to which they all pleaded guilty. The charges received would be from 3 to 10 years. So that covers pretty much the assassination of Sergei Kirov and goes into the first trials that start coming right after the assassination. And I want to stress that these are not considered the Moscow trials yet. These are just trials in regard to Kirov's assassination. Okay, so we stopped in what is it, January of 1935. Now, I will say that once we, in the next episode, we get into more of 1935, there's going to be another trial, and that's going to be called the Kremlin Affair, which is going to also involve Kamenev. It's going to relate to the assassination of Sergei Kirov. The problem is there's limited information about that particular case. So I'm going to have to do some more research on what's up with that. And then we'll probably kick off like our next episode here, or the next coming episode. But yeah, so I guess like to give some concluding thoughts, and then you can say something there, comrade. Yeah, I do think it's extremely interesting how we can see. I know we've talked about this before, but it's just interesting to see the amount of damage that was done from these people that were writing supposedly scholarly books on this, especially the Moscow trials and the Kirov assassination. When they were writing these books in like the 60s and the 70s, that's still so much of our understanding of these events. And, it's just amazing how that's shaped that so hard. But it does make it hard because, like we discussed earlier in the episode, it is very hard to study this stuff because so much of the evidence is either not released yet, or we don't know. It could have been destroyed, because we saw that Khrushchev was destroying this evidence against Zinovievites right before the secret speech. So that implies, to me at least, that there are probably other documents that we think may be in the Soviet archive, which are probably gone, or we would have never known that they existed. So, I mean, we're kind of seeing like a tip of the iceberg thing, but unfortunately, they've kind of made it hard for us researchers, of the future to study this stuff. But yeah, I wanted to see. Did you have any final comments or thoughts there on Sergei Kirov assassination, there, comrade?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's pretty disgraceful that, like, still to this day, the prevailing narrative is that Kirov was assassinated by Stalin because Stalin was jealous, or he was a egomaniac or something. And when you have even like anti-Stalin historians saying, okay, yeah, the official lone gunman narrative isn't true, it's funny how like those quiet admissions will be swept under the rug, and the prevailing lie, or the prevailing like dominant bourgeois narrative, still keeps being perpetuated regardless. And it's almost like when it comes to Stalin, when it comes to communist history in general, all all historical ethics go out the window. Your ethics as a historian and a scholar just completely go out the window, and you're willing to, in some cases, completely destroy evidence that disproves your narrative. And I feel like it's completely disgusting, but it's par for the course when it comes to these bourgeois historians.
Yeah. And I guess I do want to just say real quick before we close out, I guess what it is there's a discrepancy because, modern historians, they're still saying that Stalin did the Moscow trials and that he, had people framed for Kirov's assassination. But it is this lone gunman theory. So you do see that even amongst, people who might have like read a little more about this than the average person, I guess. But I guess one quick thing that I like to do, is just kind of a thought experiment. Like, imagine I'm not saying that it's impossible. Like, I guess it is within the realm of possibility that a leader of a country could fabricate these crimes and get rid of people that they don't like, per se. I guess I'm just imagining all the work that would entail. I'm just imagining like the kind of conversations you would have to be having with people like, okay, well, you got to get the story straight. Bolyanov is the Trotskyist who said this, and that, and Zaporets is the, I feel like we would have some documents that would have slipped out where they're like, okay, here's Stalin, like, labeling everybody and saying who's who and giving the first, but instead it's these different sources of information that are gathering this stuff. So I don't know. I feel like evidence of that would present itself in the way of having primary source documents that are coming from the Central Committee saying, okay, these are the people, this is the story, stick to it as hard as you can. But instead, it doesn't really, we haven't seen evidence like that. So I'm waiting for that day. That will be it. That will be the moment where all of us are proven wrong. But I guess we'll have to see on that one.
Yeah, and it's funny how their narrative relies on not showing the evidence, whereas we're the ones actually asking for the evidence to be released. That should tell you everything you need to know. They have something to hide.
Yeah, and I know we mentioned Grover Furr. If you read his book, which I highly suggest you do, his book on the Kirov assassination focuses a lot on the scholarship. His book, what it talks about a lot is bias of omission. That's mostly what his book is he'll be like, hey, look, here's Leno talking about this document, but look at what the document actually shows. It says all this cool stuff that we didn't know, or we wouldn't have known if he didn't tell us. So there's a lot of that. And it's honestly kind of frustrating when you start reading this stuff. But yeah, I think we covered it pretty well. I mean, there's so much more to the Kirov assassination, but I feel pretty confident leaving it there. So I appreciate everybody for listening to this. Good news is that I originally planned for this to be also combined, talking about the Trotskyist bloc and the evidence we have of that. So most of that episode is done. Hopefully that will be coming pretty soon. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks everybody. Catch you next time.
Основное, решающее, чему все обязано, это наша коммунистическая партия. Но, товарищи, все-таки самое правильное, и самая решающая, и самая определяющая наука нашей жизни – это марксизм. Чем больше, чем лучше, чем глубже и культурнее мы подкованы этой самой наукой, которая называется марксизмом и ленинизмом, той науки, которую таким величием может воплощать в жизнь наш учитель, товарищ Сталин, этой науке мы обязаны всем, в основном и решающим.